Welcome back. We're going to continue on with our info about the heart. We're going to talk about the layers of the heart and the coverings of the heart. So this is a diagram from your textbook. And some of this you've learned before. Hopefully you learned some of this at least at the beginning of Biology 201. As you guys hopefully maybe remember somewhere in the deep recesses of your mind, the heart is located within a portion of the thoracic cavity called the mediastinum. Media for medial, it's more or less kind of in the center. And then stinum is referring to the area around your sternum, that particular bone. And if you guys, one thing I want to point out to you here on the diagram, here's your heart right in here. That's the way it's more or less positioned there in the thoracic cavity. This little pointy area over in here is called the apex of the heart. Just wanted to go ahead and point that out to you. Here, of course, is your diaphragm. And you're also seeing these membrane coverings. If you guys hopefully remember your serous membrane coverings that surround the lungs and also the heart, we'll be reviewing those as well shortly, but you can see how it's positioned there. Another term that's interesting about the heart anatomically is where would you think the base of the heart is located? Now, if you're like me, first time you heard base of the heart, well, it's right there. That's the base of the heart. No, actually, the base of the heart is up here, where all of those big blood vessels emerge from the top. That is actually called the base of the heart. Believe it or not. Just to be confusing. All right, so coverings of the heart. The heart is sitting in the pericardial cavity. If you guys remember that, that's its little compartment that it's in. Pericardial cavity. And the little sac that the heart is sitting in has a double wall. So more superficial, there's actually a covering called the fibrous pericardium, which is made from dense connective tissues. Remember those? You're like, no, I don't want to have to remember tissues. Dense connective tissues has a very tough consistency, which makes sense. You want the heart's kind of important, so it's nice to have a tough fibrous covering around it. If you ever get to do a dissection of some sort of mammal in a laboratory and the fibrous pericardium is still in place, yeah, you'll see how tough it is. And then that is actually connected to some of the surrounding structures there in the mediastinum to help hold the heart in place. You don't want the heart bouncing around all over the place. All right, so internal to that, or deep to that fibrous pericardium, here's where you have your serous membranes, those thinner membranes that secrete serous fluid. And if you guys remember, those types of membranes, those serous membranes, have two layers. All right, there's a parietal layer that lines the compartment, and then there's a visceral layer that is actually in contact with the organ itself. So if you guys remember, you have the parietal pericardium. That is the relatively thin serous membrane that's up against the fibrous pericardium. And then in between the two, you have a little bit of space that has fluid in it. And then you have the visceral pericardium, which is a thin membrane that is directly in contact with the heart. So parietal membranes line the compartments or the cavities. Visceral serous membranes are directly in contact with organs. That space between the two is called the pericardial cavity, and it does have fluid in it, serous type fluid that is secreted by those membranes. And the purpose for that, of course, you don't want the heart bouncing around in a dry sac. It needs some lubrication around it to help reduce friction that helps protect the heart. Okay, here's a diagram which is blowing some of this up for you in a little bit more detail. But let me talk first about the heart wall itself. So if you cut open the heart, kind of a cross section like you see there, And so in here, these spaces, these are the insides of the chambers of the heart. So the chambers inside the heart are going to have a very thin inner lining. That's called the endocardium. That's the inner epithelium that lines the chambers inside the heart. That's the endocardium. Very thin epithelial lining. Outward from there, you have the myocardium. Remember, myo refers to muscle. So this is mainly composed of cardiac muscle tissue, and it's thick. So most of the wall of the heart consists of the myocardium. That's where you have your cardiac muscle fibers that are going to contract and allow the heart to beat. And then outward from there, your most superficial layer of the heart wall is called the epicardium. And the epicardium is the same thing as the visceral pericardium. So it's really that serous membrane that is directly in contact with the heart itself. This diagram from your textbook is pretty nice because it's zooming in on these different things that we've been talking about. So over here, here's a heart chamber. That's space inside the heart that fills up with blood. There's your endocardium. It's a very thin epithelial tissue lining that lines the chambers. Then all of this is myocardium. That's cardiac muscle tissue. Outward from there, here's your epicardium, which is just your visceral pericardium. And then notice that it's a double membrane, so it folds over actually like that. And then this outer layer is what we call the parietal pericardium. Then you got that space in there in between the two. That's your pericardial cavity that fills up with fluid. Then all this white fibery looking stuff that they've drawn in on the diagram there, it's thicker, dense fibrous connective tissue. That's your fibrous pericardium, so that's even outward from there, and that's the tougher protective sac around the heart. All right, let's talk about a homeostatic imbalance for a moment. Maybe you've heard of this before. Maybe you've heard of somebody who has pericarditis. And what that is, that's inflammation of the pericardium, those membranes that are surrounding the heart. And you can actually detect that with a stethoscope when you're listening to somebody's heart, because you have friction, rubbing. If you have inflammation, you have swelling of those tissues that surround and protect the heart like that, you can hear a creaking sound due to the rubbing together of those membranes. And there is that's pericarditis, inflammation of those membranes around the heart. In some cases, you can have lots of excess fluid or even blood around the heart. So this fluid can also be blood. It's not necessarily pericardial fluid. And that's called cardiac tamponade. And that's what they're showing you over here in this diagram. There's actually some blood that is leaking into the pericardial cavity that's surrounding the heart. And as you can imagine, so it's sitting in there in a pretty tough sac, so as all that fluid builds up, the heart doesn't have a lot of room to expand, so that fluid starts compressing the heart, and it limits the pumping ability of the heart. It's called cardiac tamponade. Like sometimes the aorta, the big giant artery that curves upward and outward away from the heart, sometimes that can start leaking blood if the wall of the aorta gets damaged. That blood can start leaking into that particular compartment. Okay, here's another look from your textbook of the myocardium. And that's the layer of the heart we're going to be spending most of our time in this chapter talking about, because that's where you have your cardiac muscle fibers that contract and make the heart beat. And I kind of like this picture because it's showing you how those cardiac muscle fibers are actually arranged within the heart, up and around the atria, your left and your right atrium. They're kind of arranged in these bundles. And down here around the ventricles, you can kind of see that they kind of have a spiral type arrangement as well. So if you can imagine those contracting together, when they contract, they literally squeeze blood, like the atria kind of squeeze the blood downward a little bit. Blood flows from your atria down in toward your ventricles. When the ventricles are contracting, based on the way those fibers are arranged, it's almost like wringing out a wet towel that helps force or squeeze blood out of the ventricles. Some of the gray tissues they're showing you here on this particular diagram represent something called the cardiac skeleton. That's not bony tissues. Those are connective tissues that provide some framework for the heart. And you got all these big blood vessels up here that are connected into the heart. Remember we said this was the base of the heart up in here. So you got a lot of connective tissues up in here where I'm drawing that help anchor those blood vessels, and also there are heart valves that we'll be taking a look at shortly that have to stay in place and need to be anchored very well there. All right, that's going to bring us into some more details on the heart chambers, and so for the next video lecture we will start to talk a little bit more about those chambers and their functions, and I will also bring up in the next video lecture visible body, and we'll start taking a look at some of the heart anatomy within that application.